Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to our latest webinar, The Future of Telemedicine and Will It Stick in a Post-Pandemic World? So just a reminder, during the presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode. We will be fielding questions at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A icon on your screen. And as a reminder, today's call will be recorded and will be offered at the conclusion of our event. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Weiser. I lead our healthcare practice at Buzzback, and I will be presenting with Rob Siebold, who is a client services director who joined Buzzback in 2012. And Rob leads a lot of our healthcare work in Europe and has wide experience in global insights, research, and has worked at agencies in the UK and Australia. His specialties include innovation, new product development, market landscape, and understanding brand and communications development. He actually recently presented similar research at Ephemera. So Rob, if you want to say a quick hello.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, looking forward to today. Thanks for joining.
Great. So what we are going to do today is talk about the future of telemedicine. Will it stick in a post-COVID world? Before we get started, we are just going to give you a brief overview of what we are going to cover today. So first we'll do a quick introduction and background. Then Rob will really be walking you through a lot of the details from our study. And then we're going to walk you through some key takeaways and get a good, really clear understanding of what this means for all of you. So before we jump into the meat of the study, we just want to talk a little bit about our blended research approach. So I know some of you have worked with us before quite a bit and have utilized our blended research approach, which is what this study entails. And in our blended research approach, we incorporate a lot of qualitative elements into online quantitative studies. And what you'll see is that by doing this, we are able to get a lot of the more implicit emotional assessment. We use visualization a lot as metaphors, projective techniques, etc., really to get people to open up about their experiences, about their perceptions, and provide us really deeper insights. So you'll see throughout this study a number of different ways of how that will be incorporated. This just gives you an example of some of the techniques that we are able to incorporate. So for instance, Rob will take you through some really interesting and exciting collaging exercise. So where visualization exercises can really be used to get people to open up about what they think and what they've been experiences. And you often are able to uncover a lot more kind of subtle nuances through this than by doing kind of more traditional research approaches. These are just some other examples that we have. So whether it be our diary approach or blob tree, etc., just to give you a sense of some of the type of work that we do. So on that note, I'm going to turn over to Rob, who's going to talk a little bit about why we focused on telemedicine throughout this engagement.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, so I mean, I guess, why telemedicine? It was sort of on everyone's radar, wasn't it? Even sort of in 2019, and, prior to when the world changed. But obviously, COVID really massively accelerated the uptake of telemedicine and the need for telemedicine. So we kind of knew that, and we were keeping an eye on things anyway. And then it made sense to conduct a piece of research. So, I mean, I pulled a couple of facts there about projected growth rates for telemedicine. One was from July last year, and one was from November last year. So, only a few months apart. And you can see that, the projection already went from like 28% growth to 40% growth in the next 5 years. So really, really dramatic uplift. But then despite that, we found that there was actually little primary research really looking at things, especially from both patient and physician perspectives. So we set out to do that. So we ran parallel studies, essentially, looking at the experiences of telemedicine throughout the pandemic, and with a view on really sort of, what was happening, how were they feeling, and what would stick beyond the kind of needs must phase of the pandemic. Okay, so enough of the kind of preamble. I'm just going to dive right in. I'm going to begin with just a method slide, just to kind of make everybody aware of what we're going to look at. So we basically conducted 3 waves of primary research during the pandemic. You can see the dates there. The first wave was July last year, so about 3 or 4 months in to the lockdowns in most countries, and then a second wave at the start of this year in February, so almost a full year into those lockdowns. And then we updated it with a third wave just recently, so that only completed in June. So pretty much spanning a full year of COVID and the pandemic. We spoke to physicians, primary physicians, so GPs in the UK, PCPs in the US, and we also spoke to patients as part of a population, a general population sample. So very robust on the patient side, and robust on the PCP side, and we covered US and the UK. And what we used was this blended approach that Jonathan mentioned. So you're going to see a mixture of some of the sort of quantitative findings and some of that qual enhancement as well. Okay. So just a little bit of signposting, just to kind of navigate us through what I'm going to share. And so we've sectioned this into 3 sort of broad areas. So first of all, we're going to look at some of the the main behavioral insights of the rapid shift and uptake of telemedicine. Then we'll look a little bit more at emotions and perceptions of how it's going, and then we'll have a future look with some thoughts about the future. Okay.
Great. So at a high level, and Rob's going to take us through this a bit more in detail, but at a high level, what we are starting to see is that PCPs are really, or have shifted rapidly to telemedicine during COVID. I think, most of us are probably not surprised. I'm sure most of us on the phone probably have had a telemedicine appointment. One thing that we found that has been really interesting is that PCPs are often using the same technology as the rest of us. So think about, we are on a Zoom call and have spent a greater part of the last year and a half of our lives on these calls. And we're seeing that while specialized apps are emerging, which is, certainly driving some change, from the beginning, they've really been using a lot of, the similar technology. We've also found that telemedicine has been used for all different kinds of appointments. And I think this will be, as Rob talks a little bit later on about sort of where things are going in the future, it's interesting to think about not just sort of where things are being used now and kind of during the pandemic, but most importantly, what will stick and where things will shift in the long run. Yeah. So on that note, I'm going to turn over to Rob just to kind of take us through a little bit more of these details.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So we'll just get beneath the surface of some of these high-level learnings and share some data with you as well. So here, what we're looking at is overall usage of telemedicine amongst physicians. So you've got the US on the left, UK on the right there, and we basically have 4 time series. So we've got the 3 tracking waves that I mentioned, and then we had a "what were you doing before the pandemic" question. And so what you can really see there is that this dramatic uplift in usage. So particularly the exclusive and often used telemedicine, so that the top 2 boxes of those bars there, you can really see how that just grew. It exploded. So it went from 20 or 30% pre-COVID to kind of 2/3 using it exclusively often in the US and almost 80% in the UK. And you can see how it really kind of was that initial phase where that big radical shift happened, and then it's been sustained as we move through the months. Okay, Jonathan mentioned about the types of platforms that are being used for telemedicine. So what we're looking at here are those platforms, US and UK again. And what I guess surprised us a little bit, but was how how prevalent the usage of these, the same platforms that we're all using to communicate. So as Jonathan mentioned, Zoom's call, we all know Teams, but this is what doctors are using as well. So Zoom was there, MS Teams particularly prevalent in the UK, Skype also just regular FaceTime calls on devices, and also regular phone calls as well. And so those were the big ones. But then we saw some specialized apps coming through too. And a real one that grew massively in the UK was AccuRx. And if you're in the UK and if you've visited a doctor, there's a good chance you will have used AccuRx. And I used it myself the other day to put my COVID vaccine. So it really kind of came out of nowhere and has got very widespread usage. And in the US, we've got DoxyMe as one of the bigger ones that has emerged. Okay, so then, obviously, given that rapid scaling up of telemedicine, initially there was a sort of a feeling, I think, amongst a lot of people that it would be there for follow-ups and some of the ongoing maintenance of patients' conditions and that sort of thing. But what we're really seeing, and looking at June this year, is kind of how it's being used for all kinds of things now. And obviously we're in a needs must phase of usage. And so what we have seen, particularly in the UK, is initial visits, new symptoms, those initial consultations. There's been a big uplift in those over the past year because people have had to. And some of the differences you're seeing between UK and the US are down to sort of structural differences in how difficult or easy it's been to see a GP in those two markets, and those differences also are probably what's contributing to some of the things we're going to see in a minute, which are some frustrations that are coming through much more strongly in the UK. Okay, so kind of some of the sort of behavioural things that were happening over the past year. Let's now have a look at experiences. So, how's it been going? What's it been like practicing with telemedicine for doctors and being on the receiving end as patients?
Great. So thanks, Rob, for taking us through kind of what people are doing. As Rob mentioned, we're now going to focus a little bit more about sort of their perceptions, their attitudes, et cetera. And, we get some really kind of interesting and rich data. And what we see here is that PCPs and patients certainly see value. And especially during COVID, I think, frankly, COVID really pushed the bounds of what was able to occur during some of these telemedicine appointments. However, we do see that it's really not right for all appointments, especially certain things like physical exams. And we do see that there's notion about this sort of less personal experience that comes about. We do, however, see that patients are a little bit more satisfied. PCPs are a little bit more frustrated by the time pressures, technology, et cetera. Rob will go through this more in detail, but likely patients are kind of getting more of the benefits in terms of flexibility and some of those things, given that they can sort of be from home, whereas a lot of the PCPs are still, a little bit less likely to reap the benefits from some of that flexibility, et cetera. And we have actually seen that PCP dissatisfaction has increased since the start of the pandemic. And then UK patients, as Rob mentioned a little bit before, are also starting to get a little bit more frustrated. So on that note, Rob, let's bring us through some of the data to back this up.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so we're going to start with kind of that high level overall satisfaction with how telemedicine appointments have felt, have gone, looking at physicians' left-hand side and patients' right-hand side to get used to the way the charts are structured like that. So, overall, a pretty healthy picture. You've got satisfaction levels, 5-point scale, looking at top two boxes, 70% plus satisfied for both physicians and patients in both markets. So overall, a pretty, we were quite surprised. People are overly satisfied. We're only showing the latest time series here because there actually hasn't been too much change, but more on that in a moment. The other thing that's really interesting here is that how patients are just that little bit more satisfied. So the very satisfied proportion of those bars, the dark blue, is just bigger, more prevalent for patients. And also it's more prevalent in the US than in the UK. And we'll see, again, there is this difference about the experience in the UK versus the US. As I mentioned, over time, we haven't seen a lot of shift in the satisfaction levels, so those top two boxes. But what we have seen is an increase in dissatisfaction. So we're not showing it, but the bottom two boxes. So that's really kind of grown a little bit over the life of the pandemic. So those three waves that we've taken over the past year. So we've kind of gone from sort of levels of about 5% dissatisfied to about 20% dissatisfied. And most of that has been a shift out of neutral on that scale, particularly for the doctors. As they've got more used to it, they formed an opinion, and some have gone into the negative. But on the patient side, and particularly in the UK, it was a real decline. So whereas you can see 72% satisfied UK patients, in our first wave, that was 87%. So we have seen a scaling back of that. So next, we'll just look at sort of from a quantitative point of view, what are some of the drivers of these perceptions? So there's quite a lot of data on these slides, so I'll go a little bit more slowly through it. But really what we're looking at here are the different aspects of the telemedicine experience and the levels of very and somewhat satisfied with those features amongst physicians in the US and the UK. So what you can see in terms of, at the top there, the things that are, that are driving satisfaction, the things that are making, that are working well, are some of those things that Jonathan mentioned, particularly benefits to patients. So able to answer patients' questions, privacy and security around the visit, time efficiency for patients. Those were the big pluses in both markets. And then in terms of some of the frustrations, really, I guess the most dramatic one is right at the bottom there. So least satisfaction with being able to remote monitor and do kind of some of those health assessments for blood pressure or bloods or heart rate and some of those sorts of things. So the other things that people are less happy about on the physician side are insurance and reimbursement in the US. So there were some concerns there. And we had another question, we're not showing it, but in the US, 79% patients expected telemedicine appointments to be cheaper and cost less than face-to-face appointments. So there's a real kind of pressure on pricing for physicians there. And that was something that they were reporting back. And then features of the platform or the app that was used. And you're going to see this, technological frustrations, inability to do some of those things, particularly as you're kind of getting more and more used to doing telemedicine, consulting via telemedicine. As that usage has increased, frustrations with technology have also increased. In terms of the differences between the markets, as I mentioned, the UK is just slightly less satisfied across the range of aspects here. And we saw that across the three waves. We also had some questions with patients that were parallel to this. We also sort of got amongst patients too. Okay.
And I think one of the most interesting, Rob, if you don't mind just going back here, I think one of the most interesting things to think about here is that we are currently in a time of disruption. So I think for a lot of our clients, let's say you work for a pharmaceutical company or a health plan or consumer health, trying to think about where there are going to be gaps in the system where ultimately you could help sort of cover these gaps. So I think this sort of assessment here to really understand where things are working well as potentially where things are not going as smooth during this time, ultimately to figure out, how can you all help sort of figure out some of those gaps? I think this is really valuable information here.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come on to it. And I think definitely around technology and definitely around the experience with the technology, that's where the real opportunities come in, or some of the main ones anyway. Okay, I'm just going to put up a slide here, which is kind of just highlighting what we've said a couple of times already, which is this slightly different experience in the UK versus the US. So just a couple of slides. On the left-hand side, we've got physicians there. They're talking about the overall quality of the relationship. And you can see how in the UK, those bottom two boxes have really grown. So overall, there's that feeling that things are not quite as good anymore, where we are now as when we initially sort of started back in June last year. On the patient side as well, we've seen that those bottom two boxes sort of less satisfied with the overall experience and the outcomes in the UK versus the US. So we haven't really seen that uptick in the US. Okay, so we've shown a lot of data slides. We then integrated one of our projected techniques. Jonathan mentioned it already. It's a collaging technique. So we've taken collaging from qual and put it into a quantitative environment. So it's basically an interactive exercise where the participant can create a collage from an image set to help them answer a question. They pick the images that are relevant to them, and then they tell us about their collage. So really the images there are catalysts, they're tools to help them to access thoughts and help them to articulate their thoughts and feelings better. So you see the little demo running there. More specifically to the study, so we took that idea of the collaging and we applied it to telemedicine and in-person appointments. And what we did is we asked them to create a collage that essentially used this kind of sort of split canvas type approach. So that we had experiences with telemedicine during COVID on one side, and then experiences and thoughts and feelings about in-person appointments before COVID on the other side. And, that kind of compare and contrast was really, really powerful way of looking at the pros and cons of both modes of consultation. So I'm just going to show you next kind of the sort of high-level summary of what we learned from the collages. So we basically summarized the main themes of all those descriptions that they gave us about their collages into the positives and the disadvantages of telemedicine. And there was a lot of commonality across physicians and patients and also across the two markets. So we were able to summarize at this very high level, and then we called out some of those differences, the little icons. But overall, on the positive side of things, so efficiency and convenience, that was a top benefit of telemedicine, especially the ease of getting an appointment, the greater flexibility, again, particularly for patients. So not having to take time off work, not having to travel to a doctor's practice, being able to have a visit in the comfort of your own home. And then obviously we were in a pandemic, and safety was clearly key and important for both doctors and patients. And that was really coming through, able to continue providing care and make it safe. And then on the physician side, physicians talked really positively about seeing a role for telemedicine in the future of their patient care. So it was something that they could see as being part of the toolkit, not the complete solution, and we'll come on to that. A point there, again, just touching on this reimbursement issue from the US. So in the US, there were signs at the latest wave that some of those reimbursement issues were starting to be addressed by the market, and it was bedding in. On the disadvantages side, the top frustration was around technology. We mentioned that already. So it's the obvious things like connection quality, but also things around access. So concerns that it's a bit more challenging for older patients to use telemedicine, and some other subgroups that may potentially be excluded if there is a telemedicine only type of route to consultations, and there were some concerns around that. Also just confidence, lack of confidence in using that technology to talk about sensitive matters for some people. The obvious limitations of it not being in person, so that inability to take tests for many people, that made it a longer process. On the physician side, they felt that they were really kind of sort of just patching things up. That's what the Band-Aid care comment there means, really kind of getting through, doing the basics, and not able to do some higher level things. And then one thing that came through and was a little bit more worrying really was, some concerns around the diagnoses themselves. So we saw, those initial visits, obviously happening more often now because we've had 15 months of pandemic. And physicians, just a little bit concerned that, diagnosis is a little bit riskier, and patients also just having slightly lower levels of confidence in those diagnoses that were made over telemedicine. And then Jonathan mentioned, on the kind of more emotive side, what we got in the collages that we didn't get so much in the metrics, was just how that kind of human touch was missing for many people, or not missing, but just dialed down. And that is a real need. So on the physician side, missing the in-person contact themselves, and particularly on the patient side, just wanting a more human and empathetic experience and that rapport with their doctor. Okay, I'm not going to expect you to read all of this, but I kind of want to just show you two examples of a couple of the collages that were created by the participants. So if you remember those sample sizes, we had lots of these. So we've got one from a doctor, one from a patient, and what I hope you can see is just the sort of level of richness that you're able to get by getting them to think about their experiences, by using those tools of the images to help them to articulate their thoughts. And so we're really able to kind of get a lot of very rich content about what it felt like through the collages. Okay, so how are we doing for time? Yeah, we're good for time. So we're just going to spend the last 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes or so wrapping up. So first of all, looking at the future of telemedicine.
Great. So Rob's talked a bit about kind of what people are currently doing, what they felt, and how things are, sort of their perceptions. We're now going to focus a little bit more around the future. And I think what's really interesting here, and I think frankly for all of us, this is probably the most valuable part. We know that there's been a tremendous amount of disruption over the past year and a half, and it has shifted things. But I think that the key question remains of what is going to stay and what will that look like? And ultimately, what will be the impact on the industry? So I think key thing here, telemedicine, Rob alluded to this earlier, it's here to stay. But we do expect things to get a little bit more normalized. So things to, decrease a little bit, especially as kind of in the US as the in-person world returns. We are finding that thinking more forward, that there will likely be this sort of hybrid blend. So this sort of telemedicine combined with the in-person, ultimately to offer this sort of more blended offerings, ultimately, hopefully to get the advantages of both. And then there's this big notion around tech. So tech advances, I think this is really one of the biggest gaps that currently exist, that is in the process of development, but that there really is an opportunity for tech to address a lot of the frustrations and sort of ultimately fill some of these gaps. And Rob will take us through this more in detail.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, so similarly to before, we just show you some of the main points that got us to these thoughts. So you will have seen this slide before, actually. So we started with this slide about the rapid upscaling of telemedicine, but we've added a projection. So we asked the physicians to think ahead and think 3 years from now, and what do they expect? How frequently do they expect to be using telemedicine? So that's where we get the sense that there is going to be this normalization, particularly in the US. So you can see how that falls away. What really surprised us initially was how in the UK it didn't fall away so much. So a little bit of normalization, but particularly given that we've seen evidence of frustrations, we were wondering, why is there still this sense that it's going to be used so much more widely and frequently than in the US? But what really kind of sort of started to click for us was that what we're looking at here is an expectation and not necessarily a desire. And what we're seeing in the UK is perhaps a reflection of some of those structural differences and pressures that exist within the NHS, and expectations on doctors with respect to their usage of telemedicine. So that was our hypothesis. So we wanted to back that up, and we did a little bit of desk research as well. And we found a couple of articles, and we actually found 3 or 4, but just picked 2 that really kind of sort of support this point. So on the left-hand side, I found this article from the BBC. It was around about the time of our first wave, and it was about how pretty much in-person appointments had completely ceased in the UK. So it was like turning off the tap in terms of in-person. So only 7 or 8% from that article of appointments were happening in person. And then a year later, so from March 2021, here was an article, and it quoted Professor Martin Marshall. He's chair of the UK GPs Association, that's the Royal College of GPs, and he was very much reporting, and the article was too, about how physicians, GPs in the UK have this sense of frustration with telemedicine. And there's a lovely quote there which really kind of sort of encapsulates what we saw in our results, which is, for many physicians, it's felt like as if they're delivering care via a call centre, which isn't at all the job they signed up for. And there was a number of other quotes along similar lines in similar articles. I didn't want a career on the telephone. That's not what I signed up for. The other thing that came through when we saw this in our collages particularly was, it's harder to pick up on the softer cues around diagnosis when you're delivering care virtually, and physicians were professionally feeling that more so in the UK. So looking forward, we asked physicians to kind of sort of do a sort of wish projection, or use a crystal ball, how they would expect or want to be using telemedicine in future. And there's really this strong sense of this hybrid approach. So telemedicine isn't suitable for all situations, and indeed for all patients. So it really needs to be part of the toolkit that physicians are ideally able to deploy as and when it makes most sense, both for them and for their patients. And it's through that blending, through that complementary offering, giving patients greater choice, that the benefits of telemedicine will really be realized. In terms of opportunity areas, really we come back to this, both physicians and patients are really seeing areas around the technology where they want improvement. So there was a strong call for improved technology for both groups to address these frustrations of this rapid and, let's face it, totally unplanned scaling up of telemedicine. So better apps and tools for remote diagnosis, for remote monitoring, better integration of telemedicine into existing practice systems and processes. So not just using those MS Teams and Zoom, but integrated platforms that fit with other processes in the practice setting. Both groups talked about connectivity issues. We all know about that over the last year, but also around access. So making sure that people have access to the technology too, and that no one is excluded. And then on the patient side particularly, there were those calls for that more personal experience, both longer appointments, so practically, but also ways to make the appointment more personal. So even if it has to be telemedicine, what can technology do to create a greater sense of connection between doctor and patient? And so, that call for technology improvements, we know this is going to come, and we just found some interesting articles and pieces which suggest that it's already happening, obviously, and particularly when you have major players out there like the Amazons of this world and like Walmart entering the space of telehealth. That's really going to drive up technological standards, and it's going to really raise the bar in terms of what more specialist providers then also have to deliver. The article that we pulled there was from March 2021, and you may or may not know, but I didn't know. But Amazon Care, which is Amazon's healthcare offering, started off as an internal offering for Amazon employees. That was already being scaled up and rolled out and offered to other companies in the US back in March this year. Okay, so hopefully that's given you, a real flavour for what we learned. I just want to spend 2 minutes summing up, and then pass over to Jonathan for some final thoughts. So what have we really seen? So we saw how that that really kind of sort of stellar growth in telemedicine. It looks like it's going to normalize post the pandemic, but it's definitely here to stay. It's not going away. And what's really exciting is that prospect of a blended offering, which is very enticing to physicians, particularly being able to offer the best of both modes to basically make a better patient experience. But there may be some need for guidance on the market as to what to use and when. So there's some opportunities there potentially. We've seen satisfaction levels overall pretty high, both doctors and patients seeing the value, particularly over the last year, but a strong realization that it's not right for all situations and all patients. And I guess the implication around that is that as the tech improves, as we get better integration of remote monitoring especially, that's really going to broaden the application of telemedicine and when it can be used. We also saw these signs of frustration, particularly in the UK. So signs of weariness setting in with greater usage of telemedicine. And in the UK, perhaps a sense of enforced usage rather than it being just that helpful option to help me continue my practice. We're going to see a natural bounce back of in-person appointments, and that's going to reset and address some of those frustrations. But then some things to think about really are, in that transition to this hybrid model of providing virtual and in-person care, what are some of those technological and process developments, possibly training as well, that can enhance that virtual component, so to make that more personal experience for both patients and physicians. And then in the US, we touched on it and just very briefly, but there were those concerns over pricing and patient expectations with respect to virtual appointments. And that's something that's starting to be addressed, but it's something that health insurers particularly need to think about. So how do they position virtual care alongside in-person care, and what can be done, particularly through technology and other developments to, I guess, address some of the value for money perceptions around virtual appointments. Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to Jonathan for a few last thoughts and considerations, and then we'll take some questions.
Fantastic. So I think what's really interesting here, Rob's taken us through a lot of really interesting and exciting data, and I think really demonstrates that we are really in a world of change and flux. And these are just some examples of similar secondary desk research that emphasize how this is really here to stay. So this, if you look at the right, or rather the left side of the slide, this is something from CD Insights that really looks at news articles mentioning healthcare's digital transformation. And you'll look here, even at the start of 2020, but that things have really, really vastly changed and increased and are continuing to increase. And I think just sort of demonstrates here, and then you look on the right, that 60% of healthcare organizations are adding new digital projects. So I think, as Rob mentioned, the whole notion of the digital element and how to incorporate in a seamless manner is so incredibly, incredibly important. On the next slide, these just show some areas where healthcare organizations are currently investing to improve the patient experience. And, once again, looking at, 2021, you've got about 75% say telemedicine. So you do see some around electronic health records, patient portals, et cetera. But there is really a key focus in this area of telemedicine. And then lastly, before we take some questions, just thinking through kind of more broadly about, what this means to you as our clients. So, how do you ultimately build your roadmap? So I think, key things, starting to think about where telemedicine fits in your strategy. So for instance, if you are a pharmaceutical company, thinking through that there may be gaps in certain telemedicine appointments, how can you ultimately address some of those gaps? What are some of these needs that may occur from these gaps? And also thinking through, again, kind of from this digital focus, this whole move and big shift, is there a need or desire to test, let's say, digital or interactive stimuli? It's something that we're actually starting to do with a lot of our clients, recognizing that how you reach out and communicate to your patients is going to differ as the focus towards digital really does increase. And then, ultimately, how can you all reinforce and support these new collaborations that have a focus on the integration of technology? So we do have a number of questions, so we're going to answer a few of them. And what I'll do is I will just read a few. So first question was, do we have plans for any research among different specialties? So I'll first start by addressing this, and then Rob, by all means, feel free to jump in. Great question. I think it's a really interesting point. We focused here on PCPs as a starting point and really wanted to see how things shift. We always tend to think of PCPs as sort of the foundation of care. It's something that we are considering. I'm not sure if we are officially going to do it yet, but I agree that, I would expect, let's say, in the areas of oncology or rheumatology, would be really different than, let's say, dermatology. So, I've heard anecdotally of people can talk to their dermatologists and even take pictures and send them things. And so, I think this is going to vary a lot by specialty, and that there are going to be certain things that people really do kind of need to come in for. Rob, any additional kind of thoughts or comments there?
Yeah, I mean, not so much about the planned research. I'm not sure about that, but we did have some thoughts about what about specialists, because obviously we have focused on primary care here, and special, as you say, it's going to vary so considerably by the type of specialism. But one thing that occurred to us was particularly that kind of pre and post procedure consultations. That's going to be an area where telemedicine will obviously stay even within the realm of specialisms. Whilst you still can't do procedures via virtual, and it's going to happen at some point, but we're not quite there yet. But certainly the pre and post consultations will be pushed more that way. And then we thought particularly post surgery, if patients are isolating, there may be opportunities to provide virtual connections to their families and things like that, so that haven't been utilized greatly or optimized. So again, just enhancing that experience even in post surgery.
Yeah, good points, Rob. And we have a few questions that are kind of interrelated and linked, but one of them being around, have we determined sort of who the right patient is for telemedicine? And then it kind of dovetails off another question we got around whether or not we have a sense of whether or not telemedicine has helped increase access. So for instance, one hypothesis I would assume would be is, let's say, telemedicine may help younger consumers get more access to care. So people who may be, a little more reticent to kind of come into an appointment, or let's say, if we're talking about underserved communities or even rural communities as well. These are really interesting questions. They're not things that we have looked at super in depth at the moment. And I don't know, Rob, if you want to even just talk about, at a high level, if you think, from the data that we've really seen, are there certain types of consumers that may be more open to telemedicine, whether it be age, gender, region, or, whether
Yeah.
socioeconomic status, et cetera?
I mean, I think probably all of those things. So, I mean, what we were getting, particularly sort of in the collages and some of the forward look projections where we asked qualitative techniques was, it's going to be better for younger patients, or the expectation at least is it's going to be better for younger age groups. Older patients may have concerns. Some underserved, as you say, potentially ethnic minorities may struggle, and some of these things. But these are all perception at the physician level, and so I guess it's kind of, the question's open, really, about how do you make sure people don't get left behind. And I think that's the concern is, it's less about what's the right patient. It's how do you not leave people behind.
Yeah, and it's a good point, Rob. And along those lines, so we also saw a few questions around access. So in terms of, what are our thoughts around healthcare providers that actually may be limited in their ability to afford a service? And I'm assuming that this is really focused around, let's say you have healthcare providers in, let's say, urban environments or lower socioeconomic communities who may not be able to afford, let's say, some of these advanced telemedicine programs, or may not be able to have the types of programs that require or guarantee, rather, the security that you may see in other areas. And I think this is something, it's not something that we have really seen sort of come up organically. I think this is going to be a big area to sort of see where things or how things progress in the upcoming years. I think, with any sort of technological advancement, to kind of echo Rob's point, there always is the possibility of leaving certain groups behind. So I think it really will be interesting to see sort of where the market will go, and in terms of what that access will look like. My gut would be is that there may be more variation in access in the US compared to the UK. The UK, where you have things being a lot more socialized, a lot more government driven, et cetera. I think it's a really interesting point in that it probably is likely that there will be more variation in the US in terms of what people will ultimately have access to. Rob, any kind of thoughts or comments there, and particularly if you agree with my assessment about the maybe a little bit more continuity in the UK?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's what we were seeing in the physicians' view. Is kind of that there was a strong call for physicians to retain the decision-making powers as to when to use telemedicine, and for what types of situations, for what types of patients. Obviously, they know their patients, they have their patient relationships. And so in terms of being able to offer the right type of access, whether it's telemedicine or in person, to the right type of patient, they were strongly calling for that as a decision that remains with them. And I think we saw lots of signs of pushback, that perhaps there is a feeling that may not happen in all cases, in all practices, as there are streamlining pressures within the NHS, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Good point. And there's, just to kind of echo that, so we got a question around how do we think, so just in terms of thinking through some of the older patients, so that the comment is that telehealth has a large impact on providing good care to older patients, which I think we can all agree. But then there is this notion that a lot of these older patients may struggle with technology. How do we think the future of telehealth will address that? And I think that this is a big point. I think it's a really important point. I honestly don't know if the industry or if the market is aware of this. I think this is where this sort of, kind of trying to figure out what are the types of patients that this is most appropriate for. What are technologies that can be utilized in a way that is, really kind of user friendly, et cetera. I do think that one thing that is really interesting, and we gave a big kind of post-COVID, or not post-COVID, but trends that we are seeing in a COVID kind of world. And what we did see is that even a lot of the older consumers were actually, say forced, but did rely on technology more than they previously had prior to the pandemic. So I think, that may help with some of these older patients, just getting a little bit more exposure to technology and being a little bit more used to some of these areas. But I do think that there still will be gaps, and trying to figure out where those are, and ultimately how to develop technology that really is user-friendly, especially for some of these older patients. Rob, any other thoughts there, just about sort of what that could look like?
I mean, only the same as you. And I think you framed it, or we've obviously framed it in the context of telemedicine, but it goes beyond that, doesn't it? Because it's about access to everything, because everything is accessible via the internet, particularly sort of government services, utilities, whatever. So I guess these issues about, which groups do you leave behind, and issues about access, issues about technological confidence, and all of those sorts of things, they're just societal issues. Obviously, we see them within telemedicine, and there will be different expressions within telemedicine. But particularly here in the UK, we've had similar conversations about education. As we had to move to home education, and not every house has a laptop that they're able to give their child to be able to have that access to education. So I think it's not just older patients, and I kind of falls back down on, I guess, government, particularly in the UK, and technological progress.
Great. And we've got about time for about one or two more questions. So one question is, have you seen any examples of highly targeted consumer-focused groups that are focusing, like, let's say, whether it's stopping smoking or dealing with allergies? One example that kind of comes to mind initially is in the mental health space. So there have been a lot of apps that, and this is even something I would say that has been happening since before COVID, although I think has been expedited. There have been a lot of apps that have been incorporated, let's say, around, cognitive behavioral therapy, more in the kind of mental health space. I think the whole smoking cessation is really interesting. I think that this is really still an area that is being developed. I think, dermatology is something that comes to mind. There are certain sort of specialties, certain conditions that kind of lend themselves to where a more visual or more kind of mental or emotional care can be given. But I think there are areas where, you need to have your physical tests, et cetera, where it could be a little bit more challenging. So I think this is really still a work in progress in the industry, but I think that there are some natural areas that do lend itself a little bit more towards telemedicine. And then we just have time for one other question about whether or not we know what proportion of patients were managing their COVID symptoms versus other conditions with telemedicine. And it's a good question. I don't think we actually looked at this specifically, but we do, kind of given what we have seen in other research, the proportion of patients who were tested positive with COVID was, I think sort of similar, what we have seen in the US, and they still are, albeit large number of respondents, still are a small proportion. So I think that we could assume that most of these telemedicine discussions are not as much focused around COVID symptoms, et cetera, and do cover a variety of other areas. I don't think we have a strong or a firm number around that, but especially when we looked about what people are sharing and sort of their open-ended responses, we got a lot of richness around kind of more routine things or some of these other areas. And I think it was clear that it really wasn't necessarily just focused around COVID, something sort of in the moment now, but did cover a lot of other areas. Rob, it seems like you agree with that?
Yeah, no, you very much. I mean, we didn't really split it out, but I think what we were getting was reportage across a range of different conditions, symptoms, and consultations. It wasn't all about COVID. No.
Great. Well, good. Well, we thank everyone for joining. And just a reminder, this session, as I mentioned earlier, was recorded and will be sent out post the session. So we certainly encourage you to share with your colleagues and your teams. And by all means, if any of you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to both Rob and me.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. And yeah, thanks everyone for listening. And yeah, hope to see you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.